Hey guys, welcome to the third video in our C# Basics tutorial series. Today we're going to be going over the method, and you might also hear this called the function, but the two terms are interchangeable. So the method is a really great and powerful tool that you'll want to utilize very often, okay? So just a quick overview of what we're going to be going over in this video. We're going to talk about how to declare methods. We're going to talk about access modifiers. You're going to learn what those are. You're going to learn return types. And you're going to be learning just a few more things in general about methods, okay? So the first thing I'll say is that methods reside within classes. So in the last two videos, we've talked about kind of how the namespace is just a container for related classes. Classes are just containers for related methods. So you declare a method inside of a class, okay? Now, how to declare a method and what is a method? So a method is basically a container for code that performs a specific task or operation. So let's say that could be a logger where you want to write to the console and save to a file, and you're going to be doing that often. Or maybe it's a specific mathematical calculation that you do very often. It could be anything you want, okay? But basically, methods are just a chunk of code that you can recall multiple times. And it's best practice that if you're going to be writing the same code over and over, you want to be making a method. If you're going to be using the same code or very similar code more than once, okay? So a method can also be recalled throughout your application depending on its access modifier. And you can either call it within the same class. You can do recursive methods where you call the same method within itself, which is pretty cool if you're parsing through a directory or something like that. And you can also call them within structs. You can call them in separate classes. So if I have, we have our program class, but we also have this sum class in a different namespace. If I had this, if I have a public method, I can call it within here. So it's very handy. Now, similar to static properties, which we talked about in the last video where we talked about classes, if you haven't seen that, go ahead and check that out. But static methods are also a thing. And static methods are basically tied to the type of the class. So remember in our last video, we used the car example, and we talked about how car was our custom type. Well, if I had a method that said car dot give model, and I wanted to return the model of the car if I didn't have a property or something, just as an example, that would be that method would be tied to the type of car, okay? So similar to static properties in classes, static methods are also accessed directly through the class without having to instantiate the class. So if I have a static method inside of this program class, elsewhere, if it was public static, I could call program dot, and then our method would show up, okay? So that's kind of enough gibbering, or just talking, not gibbering. So let's go ahead and show y'all what a method actually looks like. So we could start off with a very basic example, and we could, let's say we want to abbreviate console.writeLine, this method, into just write, okay? So typically you're going to want to start with your access modifier. So your access modifiers are as follows. We have public, private, protected, internal, protected internal, and private protected, okay? But we're just going to be going over public and private, and these are by far the most common method access modifiers you're going to be using, okay? These four down here, we're not going to be, I'll talk about them, but we're not really going to be using them or going over them nearly as much because we don't really use them as much in practice. So let's make a private, and then we have our return type. So up here, I'll show you what the syntax of a method is. So method declaration syntax, and then we have, so we have our access modifier, and then we have our return type. We have a name, 2 parentheses, and opening and closing brackets. Okay, now these brackets are going to be on new lines in C#. In Java and JavaScript, you'll see methods written with 1 brace out here and then 1 brace on the new line. But in C#, generally speaking, you do it both on separate lines. Okay, so access modifier is going to be private, and then our return type. So what is a return type? Well, remember in our first video when we talked about variable declaration, we had types such as string, int, double, float, anything you want. It could be boolean or bool, u short, u long, any type. It could be a list of type, IEnumerable of type, and we'll talk about lists and enumerables in a upcoming video. But and those are really fun to work with, collections. But for this example, we're just going to use void. Okay, and void is a very popular return type, but the funny thing about void is that it means there is no return type. So whenever we want to declare a method that doesn't return anything, such as if it's saving to a file, writing to the console, those are things where you don't need a return type, but instead it's performing an operation. So instead of performing something like a calculation or a string concatenation, where maybe you're manipulating a string in a certain way, maybe you're maybe you want to split parts of a file into a string array, that is where you would want to use an actual return type. But since we're not getting anything back out of the function to recall later, we're just going to have this as void. Okay, so then we'll just call this write because we're abbreviating console.writeLine. Now I should also write in here parameters. So yes, we have parentheses, and yes, we have our braces. Yes, this will work, but remember, console.writeLine, when we use console.writeLine, what's wrong here? I don't know why this isn't okay. It's giving me an error for no reason, but class program, oh, it's because I'm within the class. Oh, right, we probably should get a main method here. So static void main string array args. I didn't realize I didn't have this, my bad. So if we have console.writeLine, it takes in an argument, and obviously it has 17 overloads, which means, as you guys saw in a previous video, it could take in an integer, double, float, string, whatever. But the typical is string. So my point is that this takes in a string as a parameter. But if we're going to call write, we have to pass, if we're going to call our write function, we have to pass something. Maybe I need to have this public. Anyway, we'll fix this in a moment. If we're going to call write, we're going to have to pass in a string. Okay, so anyway, down here we can just write in string arg, and this is the name of the parameter that you reference within the function. So because we know that this is a string, if we call arg dot, we have all the properties that belong and extensions that belong to the type of string. So and of course all we want to do down here is just console.writeLine arg. So when you write and declare a function and you recall that function, we can basically, yeah, okay, so you pass something in. It's now named arg, and then you can reference the variable down here and manipulate it within your function however you want, but it doesn't change anything out here. And so I think the solution to this is just to make this private static, and we should be able to call write. Yeah, so generally speaking you don't want to use static, but just for this, oh, it's because this is a static void function, but if we took away that static, we should just be able to call write just fine. Okay, great. So yeah, this is technically a function. So if now we have console.writeLine test, but now we have write test, and the point of this is not only is this shorter, but let's say not only did I want to write to the console, but maybe I wanted to write to a file. Maybe I want to manipulate this and have a very specific log message that's consistent throughout the console. So, you know, maybe I wanted to add the date time to the console.writeLine. So now I could do, you know, date time dot now dot toLong date string and recall arg right here. So instead of doing this over and over and over, whoopsies, for every time I want to write to the console in this specific way, now I can just recall write. Isn't that great? So that's the whole point of methods. It's to have complicated or long-winded code that you want to recall over and over and over. Okay. So now let's now that we've declared our first function, and you guys get the idea, where you can have, you know, other code here. Let's talk about actual return types. So let's say we want another function that takes in an integer and returns the integer divided by 5.5 as a decimal. Okay, so let's say I had private, because we're not trying to access this. If we wanted to access this method inside of another class, sure, we could make it public, but we're just going to want private. Now remember, we're returning a decimal, so yes, in C# there is the decimal type, but no one really uses that. But let's say we want a very specific number. You know, I could use a float for this, but double is preferable. Just hypothetically, let's say double is preferable. Private double, because we want to return a double out of this function. Private double divide by 3. Okay. Parenthesis. And then what do we want as our parameter? Well, we want an integer num. We're going to call it num. We could call it x, we could call it y, we could call it z, we could call it anything we want, but we're going to call it num. Remember our braces? And so now we have a compiler error. But if I were to comment this out in the void function, we don't get any kind of error. So why is that? Well, this function is expecting a return, you know, something to be returned out of the function of type double. And right now nothing is being returned. So if I return num, this will work actually, because it's just a number. But let's say, and by the way, we use the return keyword to kind of tell us what we're going to be kicking out of the function. So if we're going to be dividing this by 3, we're going to do num divided by 3. So we can do this, var div for divide equals num over 3. Now, something to note is that because we're using var, this div is actually still an integer. this is called integer division. So when you divide an integer by another integer, it's actually not going to give you a decimal. It's going to round to the nearest integer. So what we have to do is we have to do this thing called casting. And casting is really cool because when you, in C#, when you divide a floating point type, so either decimal, float, or double, by any number, you're going to be getting a floating point number type in response. So just for giggles, if I do 3.25, div becomes a double. But we're not doing 3.25. What if I did 3.00? Div is actually still a double. But generally speaking, what I always do is I just cast our integer as double. Now to cast, all you do is in front of the variable, you write parentheses. So you're kind of just, it's almost, think of it like you're doing multiplication. Like in math, if you have a number in parentheses next to something, you're multiplying it. So you're kind of, obviously you're not multiplying this, but you know, it's just a nice way to think about it. You're distributing this type to this variable. So that's a good way to remember it. So we're casting num as type double divided by 3 without a decimal, and div is now a double because we're doing floating point division now, which is what we want. So now we can return div. Now you don't even have to declare a variable for this. We could have just done return double num over 3. And typically that's what you want to do. You don't need to declare a variable and then just return the variable right away. You can just return the operation. So remember, this return keyword, it can only be used once, and basically it stops all code. So if we had code below this, console.writeLine, or we could actually do this, we could call write, we could write success. But because we have the return keyword above this and we don't have a conditional operation by using an if statement or anything like that, and I can get into if statements in another video, we have an error or a warning. It says unreachable code detected, and then it's grayed out. So we can do this. If, you know, num divided by 3 does not equal 0, just for giggles, we can return that. Otherwise, actually, we're gonna write error. Okay, so now, because we have a conditional, and it still gives us an error because we're not returning a double, we could return 0. Because we have the return keyword up here under a conditional, we can still execute this code if this condition isn't met. But all we're doing is we're dividing this by 3, so what's the point? Now, anyway, that's basically how you write a basic function. And remember, this could be any type. It could be a string, it could be any type in the language, okay? It could even be your own custom type. So methods are extremely powerful, okay? And that really kind of covers it. So, you know, just a recap, we learned the method declaration syntax. We have the access modifier, so private or public, or any of these up here. We have the return type, which could be void or double or any other type. Maybe in a more advanced video, I'll get into asynchronous tasks, because tasks are really, really handy. But tasks are kind of like void. But you could also return a task of a type. You can return lists of types. You can do anything you want. And then we name the function. Now, generally speaking in C#, you have functions labeled in title case. If you had a, like, let's say you had double div by 3 equals r, whoops, equals, just follow, you don't have to follow along here, and dot parse arg0. But let's say you can actually have a like a double div by 3 that is it's kind of like a local function. So let's see, and return like int dot parse arg0 divided by 3. So you can actually have kind of a chunk of code within a method, but it's just not like private double. Like if I do private double, it doesn't like that at all, because this is just within the scope of one function. And this is actually something I learned, you know, a couple months ago, and I've been doing this for over a year. So, but yeah, that's kind of it. And of course you have the name of the function, you know, title case, where it's every kind of word is capitalized. You have the parameters, so you can also separate parameters by commas. So int num, int num2, and let's say we want to divide by, like, let's say we wanted to divide num by num2. You can do that. You can have as many arguments as you want. And then you have the braces and whatever you're returning. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Any suggestions on how to make future videos, anything you guys want to see in future videos, feel free to leave them in the comments. If you learned something, hit the like button. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next tutorial. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you again soon. Take care.